In 1845, 15 years before Abraham Lincoln became President of the United States, a 27-year-old man who had grown up in a family of very modest means in Concord, Massachusetts, went to live in the woods to conduct an experiment in living. Today, people in virtually every area of the world know about this man's experiment because he wrote a very famous book about it, a book entitled Walden. And the reason the book is entitled Walden is that Henry David Thoreau built a one-room cabin in the woods next to a pond called Walden. Walden has been translated into virtually every modern language, so that since Thoreau died in 1862, the book has sold untold millions of copies. Why is Walden considered to be a great book? Well, like other great books, it compels us to think more deeply. And also it makes us more aware of ourselves. Indeed, the book, in a certain sense, wakes us up. And that's no coincidence, because Thoreau, on the original title page of Walden, said that one of his objectives in writing the book was to wake his neighbors up. And here's what Thoreau says about the idea of being awake, and I'm quoting him. "To be awake is to be alive. I have never yet met the man who is quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face?" Biographer Walter Harding, who has written what many consider to be the definitive biography of Thoreau, has said that Walden is above all a guidebook to the higher life. Thoreau addressed himself in his book to the question of what is the highest art? Is painting, sculpture, teaching, practicing law the highest of arts? Thoreau said no. Here is his response, and I'm quoting him. "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts." Ralph Waldo Emerson, the very famous lecturer and writer and poet, who also lived in Concord, Massachusetts, and perhaps knew Thoreau better than anybody else, said this about him. He said Thoreau was interested in cultivating the art of living well. Thoreau had this comment on philosophers. He said this: "To be a philosopher is to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically." Well, how did he live his 44 years? Thoreau was born in 1817 in Concord, Massachusetts. He was born into a family of very modest means. He was a serious child, and at age 17, he gained entrance to Harvard College, and he went there with the help of a scholarship. He graduated in 1837 at around the age of 20, I should say around the time of his 20th birthday. Well, what did Thoreau do between the time he graduated Harvard at age 20 and his premature death from tuberculosis at age 44? Well, he only worked a regular job for about 2 years. He taught school for approximately 2 years. Thoreau liked leisure, and he wanted to cultivate many of his interests, and among those interests, some of which helped him to earn a living, were the following. He was a surveyor, and from what we know, a very fine surveyor. He was a carpenter. He was a gardener. For a time, he worked in his father's pencil factory. He was a lecturer, although he did not get the opportunity to lecture as much as he desired. And of course, his main interest was in writing. And during his lifetime, he had 2 books published. Joseph Wood Crutch was a professor at Columbia University for many years and a Thoreau scholar. And Crutch said this. He said the one word that summarizes Thoreau's philosophy is the word simplify. And in fact, Thoreau uses that word in Walden. He mentions that he was deliberately trying to simplify his life, that this experiment in the woods was, in a sense, an experiment in simplifying his life. And what did he aim to simplify? Well, Thoreau believed that one should simplify one's needs and ambitions, or at least he should, and that one should learn to delight in the simple pleasures which the world of nature affords. And also, Thoreau believed that at least for him, and he implied that this was true also of other people, but at least for him, it was very important that he scorn public opinion. Thoreau was the quintessential nonconformist. Allow me to zero in on some specific aspects of his philosophy. He urges us to be introspective. In one of his most famous essays, he says, "Let us consider the way in which men spend their lives." Let us consider the way in which men spend their lives. Thoreau, in some ways, is reminiscent of Socrates. One of Socrates' most famous maxims, which he expressed in Plato's Apology, is this. Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The unexamined life is not worth living. So Thoreau urged himself and others to examine their lives, to see what they could do to live more satisfying lives. And how did Thoreau believe the lives of the majority of people he knew and observed were like? Well, let me give you his own words on this. Thoreau said this, and again, this is a very famous passage from Walden. Thoreau said, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." He also, in his journal, wrote this. He said, "Dis-ease is the rule of our terrestrial life." Well, what to do if life is difficult, and if we human beings suffer from anxiety and nervousness and restlessness? Well, what can we do to live a better life? Well, let me give you Thoreau's prescription, at least for himself. Thoreau urges us to be a Columbus. He says we should explore ourselves. And in what way should each of us be a Columbus? He says this, "Be a Columbus to whole new continents and worlds within you, opening up new channels, not of trade, but of thought." Thoreau is encouraging himself and others to think more deeply. Why think more deeply? Well, he says this. He says that in thinking deeply, we can discover the higher self, that we will discover 1,000 regions of our minds yet undiscovered. He also says that thinking deeply can be extremely important in helping us to disabuse ourselves of illusions. Thoreau believed that he and many other people, have mistaken ideas about life, and that if we're going to live more satisfying lives, happier lives, it's very important that we free ourselves from these illusions. He believed we have illusions about work, about status, about money, and most of all about joy and where to find joy. Thoreau is regarded today as a transcendentalist. Emerson and Margaret Fuller are also known as transcendentalists. Both of them, again, were contemporaries of Thoreau. What's a transcendentalist? Well, a transcendentalist is someone who believes that there is an innate knowledge in man that transcends the senses. The transcendentalists refer to this innate knowledge as one's inner voice, as one's inner light. And they believed that this inner light, this inner voice, allows us to access higher truths through intuition. Again, the transcendentalists believed that there are certain higher truths which we can access only through intuition, and that thinking deeply is one of the paths to refining our ability to intuit. The transcendentalists also believed that society generally had a corrupting influence on people. I think it's fair to say that's the reason the Transcendentalists were nonconformists. They believed that people were born good, but that society so often corrupted them. Allow me to give an example. Thoreau and Emerson believed that no child had ever been born who believed that slavery was good, but that they were taught that slavery was good. In other words, society had corrupted them. Thoreau says this, and I'm quoting him, "There is but little virtue in the action of the masses of men. There is but little virtue in the action of the masses of men." And Emerson said this, "Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist." Thoreau also suggests that thinking deeply can increase our freedom. He says this, and I'm quoting him, "Men talk of freedom. How many are free to think? Free from fear, from perturbation, from prejudice. 999 in 1,000 are perfect slaves. What is all your building if you do not build with thoughts? What is all your building if you do not build with thoughts? You conquer fate by thought. You conquer fate by thought." That's very Freudian. Is Thoreau suggesting that we can think ourselves into being less fearful and less anxious? I think he is. Thoreau believed that good books can help us to think more clearly. Indeed, in Walden, he has a segment entitled, or I should say subtitled, Reading. And he says this about books. "Books can put a new aspect on the face of things for us. How many a man has dated a new era in his life from the reading of a book? The at present unutterable things we may find somewhere uttered." Thoreau believed that books, the great books, can often tell us what our relatives and friends can't tell us or won't tell us. Thoreau said this about the classics, and he was an avid reader of the great books. He said, "For what are the classics but the noblest recorded thoughts of man?" Thoreau also believed in the importance of solitude. He believed solitude was indispensable in our efforts to think more deeply. And again, in Walden, he has a section subtitled Solitude. He mentions that when he was living in the woods for more than 2 years, people often asked him if he was lonely. And in Walden, he provides the response. He says this, "I love to be alone. I have never found the companion that was so companionable as solitude. We are, for the most part, more lonely when we go abroad among men than when we stay at our own chambers." How so? How can we be more lonely with other people than when alone? Well, Thoreau explains that. He says that so often, in ordinary conversation, surface meets surface. And he elaborates. He says this, "I sat at a table where were rich food and wine in abundance, but sincerity and truth were not, and I went away hungry." Thoreau often laments the rareness of sincerity. He says this, "Simple sincerity and truth are rare indeed." And he goes on to say that man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity. Man's noblest gift to man is his sincerity. Emerson, in his memorial essay on the occasion of Thoreau's death, said this, and I'm quoting Emerson, "Thoreau was sincerity itself." Even though Thoreau was a loner, he did seek friendship. He was interested in friendship. And from what we know, Emerson was probably the best friend he ever had, although the friendship went through various stages, as I think all friendships do. At times, the friendship was more intimate than it was at other times. In any event, Thoreau, in his first book, entitled On the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, talks about illusions people have about friendship. And he says this: "We are acting a part in a more interesting drama than any written. We are dreaming that our friends are our friends and that we are our friends' friends. Our actual friends are but distant relations of those to whom we are pledged. We never exchange more than 3 words in our lives on that level to which our thoughts and feelings habitually rise." Thoreau believed that one of the obstacles to friendship is mask wearing, and he says this: "Why should I speak to my friends? For how rarely it is that I am I, and are they then they?" Which reminds me of some ideas from some other people, famous people, who have commented on this idea. M. Scott Peck, the very famous psychiatrist, said this: "Most people opt for a life of very limited honesty and openness and relative closeness, hiding themselves from the world." And Charles Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, wrote this. He said, "Every human creature is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other human being." Thoreau claimed that he was partly responsible for his failure at friendship. And he says this: "If I have not succeeded in my friendships, if I have not succeeded in my friendships, it was because I demanded more of them and did not put up with what I could get. And I got no more, partly because I gave so little." As most Thoreau fans know, I should rephrase that and say, as most people who know anything about Thoreau are aware, Thoreau was very interested in nature, and Thoreau believed that nature could be a source of inspiration and also an aid in seeing the enduring, the permanent, in contrast to the transient. And let me give you some of Thoreau's observations on nature. You recall I mentioned he lived in the woods for a little more than 2 years as his experiment in living. On the subject of lakes, and Thoreau loved lakes, he said this: "A lake is the landscape's most beautiful and expressive feature. It is the earth's eye, looking into which the beholder can measure the depth of his own nature." On the subject of a pleasant spring morning, Thoreau wrote this: "In a pleasant spring morning, all men's sins are forgiven. Such a day is a truce to vice." And on the topic of the rainbow, "Is not the rainbow a faint vision of God's face?" Thoreau loved trees, and in Walden writes about visiting trees. He says this: "Instead of calling on some scholar, I paid many a visit to particular trees, such as the black birch, of which there are handsome specimens in this neighborhood, 2 feet in diameter. These were the shrines I visited, both summer and winter." He also comments on the pleasures of an early morning walk. And he says, "An early morning walk, preferably in the woods, is a blessing for the entire day." And he adds, "Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads." Thoreau was a rather persistent critic of materialism, and in Walden he talks about the cost of things, and his take on what something such as a house costs is, I think, somewhat different than that of the typical American, or typical person for that matter. Thoreau says that the cost of a thing is the amount of one's life one must exchange in order to get it. Thoreau says that as a consequence of this, when the farmer has got a house, it may be the house who's got the farmer. Emerson said this, again about Thoreau and his dislike of materialism and his critique of materialism. Emerson said that Thoreau chose to be rich by making his wants few. Thoreau chose to be rich by making his wants few. Thoreau also commented on the idea of success and how one should measure success. And here again, his approach to success is, I think, quite different from that of the typical American or typical person perhaps anywhere in the world. Thoreau did not accept the common definitions of success. And he stimulates us to think about what might be the best ways to measure success. In other words, if I am trying to determine whether my life has been a success or not, what standards might I use to make the determination? Should I use money, status, and power as the standards? Or should I use other standards, such as tranquility, perhaps? That if I've led a successful life, perhaps I've had a lot of tranquil moments, maybe even joyful moments. Or should I use virtue as the criterion? So many of the religious thinkers, perhaps all of the religious thinkers in history, have said that the best way to judge the success of one's life is to look upon how virtuous we have been. Should knowledge be a criterion? Should love be a criterion? Should experiences be a criterion? One of the things Thoreau was very interested in doing, besides being a virtuous person, by the way, Thoreau was very interested in having many different kinds of experiences. He thought that would make his life worthwhile, so that when he came to die, he would not feel that he had not lived. Thoreau also commented on technology, and as one might expect, Thoreau had very ambivalent feelings about technology. He said this: "Our inventions are wont to be pretty toys which distract our attention from serious things." Again, our inventions are wont to be pretty toys which distract our attention from serious things. He went on to say, "Our inventions are but improved means to unimproved ends." And he wrote about the fact that when he was alive, our government was engaged in establishing a magnetic telegraph between Maine and Texas. And Thoreau had ambivalent feelings about this. On the one hand, he said, well, that's good. Maine and Texas will be able to communicate with each other. But he said, on the other hand, maybe it's not so good, because perhaps Maine and Texas have nothing important to say to each other. I suspect that if Thoreau were alive today, he would have some significant comments to make about cell phones. I suspect that Thoreau would claim that cell phones have not improved the quality of our conversations. Yes, cell phones make it much easier for us to communicate with one another. In that sense, they're very good. But have cell phones improved the quality of our conversations? Have cell phones made people more sincere? Have cell phones made people more loving? Have cell phones been more responsible for people to be less prone to mask wearing in their communications with other people? Thoreau addressed himself to the subject of self-esteem, and he said that he believed that if one wanted self-esteem, that conformity is not the way. And he said this, and I'm quoting him: "Public opinion is a weak tyrant compared with our own private opinion. What a man thinks of himself, that it is which determines his fate." Thoreau believed that when we seek the approval of other people, it's a kind of bondage, a kind of slavery. And he said that conformity is an impediment to living well. Let me give you his own words. And again, these are very famous words from Walden. If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. Let him step to the music he hears, however measured or far away. He went on to say that we are all sculptors and painters, and our material is our own flesh and blood and bones. He says that any nobleness begins at once to refine a person's features, and any meanness to imbrute a person's features. You might wonder if Thoreau liked living in the woods so much. Why did he eventually leave? Well, towards the end of Walden, he explains that. He said, I went to the woods as an experiment, and I left the woods because I felt I had other lives to live, other experiments to conduct. He urges us to experiment, and also Thoreau reminds us that to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.